It's finally Saturday, or it should be by the time this video comes out, so I'm hoping you all are having a wonderful weekend so far. But let's just jump straight in and talk about what we're here for, which is the Lightfall Campaign. Now, I actually managed to beat the Lightfall Campaign in a similar fashion to what I did with the Witch Queen, so I think it took me around 8 hours to do the Legendary Campaign. The start of the story wasn't really anything to write home about. It was quite cool actually going through a Presage-like mission again, but ultimately Osiris kind of pieced out and just left us there on the ship to burn and crash, but, you know, our Guardian is a bit more resilient than that. After which we actually crashed into Neomuna, but this is where I'm going to stop talking about specific story events, because if you haven't played Lightfall, then I encourage you to go and play it. I'm not going to spoil any more of the story events, but I will talk about my experience through the actual campaign. Because being brutally honest, from a story perspective, I wasn't that invested. It didn't really feel like anything urgent was going on. Like, I kept a very loose mind about the story and what was actually going on, but it just didn't grip me like the Witch Queen did. I had no sense of urgency, if anything. But the one thing I will talk about is definitely the difficulty, because, my god, it is definitely a step up from Witch Queen. It is considerably tougher, and if you're not prepared for the added difficulty, then you're going to be in for a very shock surprise, especially when the first Tormentor shows up. But having said that, I was expecting the added difficulty because Bungie was obviously talking about their new difficulty thing for Neomuna, and I've got to say, it works wonders. I was constantly being challenged throughout the campaign. The enemies were doing just enough damage and being aggressive enough to keep me on my toes, but at the same time, it wasn't too difficult for me to just basically throw in the towel and go back onto normal mode. Because I'm going to be completely honest, I thought, especially towards the end of the campaign, that I was going to get to a point where the legendary missions was going to be so tough to do alone that I would end up just throwing the towel in and just completing the story on normal, but fortunately that did not happen. Albeit there were some extremely frustrating moments in the campaign, mostly because of silly deaths or just overwhelming odds. Like, I think the second to last mission is pretty much an understatement when it comes to overwhelming odds, but if you've played the campaign, you'll understand. But speaking specifically about that mission just for a moment, I'm not going to obviously reveal too much, but as you can probably tell from the gameplay that's on the screen now, Kayatel is actually in the Lightfall campaign, which I'm happy to see. I love seeing Kayatel in the story. Her part to play in it was pivotal, I'm going to say, but there were very weird interactions between her and Nimbus, but that's an entirely different thing. That mission specifically where Kayatel does actually come in and give you a hand, that mission was just tough for a whole other reason, which is instead of the enemies being super aggressive, you kind of got to push out and be aggressive on them if you're going to win. Because up until that point, the campaign was pretty much just sit back, be patient, and try and figure out a good way of navigating around the areas to actually take down bosses and whatnot. But when you get to that mission, it flips itself on its head in a weird way, because if you sit back and just not really do a great deal, and just let the AI do it, the AI kind of just get overrun, and obviously when the AI gets overrun, then you're going to be next, and because you're on Legendary, they're going to do a lot of damage, and there is a lot of them. Which is another thing I feel like I could take across the entire campaign. The ad density across the entire campaign seems to be a lot more than it was in Witch Queen. If I was going to draw comparisons on how dense the ads were, then if you think back to the Witch Queen DLC, where there's a section just before Savathûn where you have to fight 3 Hive Guardians, and there's a lot of ads in like this small platform kind of area, that is basically the level of ad density you're experiencing throughout the majority of the campaign. But in terms of drawing comparisons between the two campaigns, I'm actually going to talk about the actual special enemies, which in Lightfall's case is the Tormentors, but in the Witch Queen it was the Hive Guardians. Now originally the Witch Queen, the Hive Guardians were tough to take down because it was something new. We had never really experienced anything like it before, so we didn't know exactly how to deal with it to start with. But as soon as you got the campaign down, it was actually fairly straightforward to take down Hive Guardians, especially in the story missions when you're doing it again for the Pinnacles. In Lightfall, different story, because the Tormentors, even though they are tough in the campaign, I have a feeling they're still going to be tough no matter where you fight them. Because unlike the Hive Guardians, it's not a simple case of just unleash a super and away you go, or just shoot it in its head a few times and eventually it'll go down and crush the ghost. No, the Tormentors have a specific way of fighting them, and when you get them down to half health, they kind of have a second form where they will just charge at you, so it makes them even tougher to deal with. So I think the Tormentors are actually going to be a nice challenge from here on out. I even expect them to see him in the raid, weirdly enough, but that remains to be seen if that will actually be the case. But just to wrap up this, I'm actually going to talk about Callus's involvement, and I'm going to be honest, I expected more from Callus, because I know he's been built up to be sort of missing and then a villain at the end of the day, but when you actually deal with him within the campaign, there is not that much of him. Like back in Season of the Haunted, when we were doing the final mission for that and we actually had to fight the Callus big head thing, that felt like Callus had more involvement in that season than he did in this DLC, which is really strange to say. Like, I do know he's there throughout most of the campaign and narrating through certain events, but the reality of it is we only really encounter him once, which is at the end of the campaign if you couldn't guess, but that is the closest thing to a spoiler that's going to be in this video, and it's at the end, so if you're still here, thank you for watching this long. But I would have really liked to have seen Callus make a big grand appearance, like in Neomuna itself, maybe on the front line somewhere. Like, let's say you beat a Tormentor on Neomuna, but then all of a sudden Callus shows up and then pretty much uses Psychokinesis and throws you somewhere, or the weird witness kind of power. Like, just that as an introduction to Callus would have been good, but then you could have built off that and have him in separate encounters building up through the campaign. Like, no matter how many times you encounter him, you just can't seem to do any damage or beat him in any way until the very end when you've actually learned Strand. I feel like that would have been much better for the campaign on a story perspective, but at the same time, I'm not too surprised because the final shape is supposed to be the final DLC, so it would make sense that Lightfall is building up to it. And speaking of which, what about that ending? Yeah, I'm not going to talk any more about that ending because if you haven't played the game, you won't know, but yeah, that ending was I would have pulled the trigger, we'll put it that way. But going into like a final score kind of thing for the campaign, I'd probably have to give this a 6 out of 10 if it was going to be out of 10 because it wasn't anything good, but at the same time, it wasn't anything bad. It was just sort of in the middle, like, it's a story at the end of the day. The good thing about the story was it did forward the narrative in its own way, and it had its own twist, which was nice. One con of it would be that I don't like Nimbus. I find him quite annoying, actually. I actually enjoy his company more when I'm talking to him as a vendor, because that way he only has small snippets, but that's just me. Another con that I'd pick out was that the pokers weren't really involved. They are still completely mysterious creatures that we have no idea what they are. Like, I think the only bit of lore we kind of learned about them were they were kind of like emotional support, if anything, for the Cloud Striders. But then it makes absolutely no sense why Elsie Bray has one, even though I know she's been through a lot. It just, there could have been more to that, and you could have had at least a side quest to explain it. I don't know, I think there's just a lot of wasted opportunities in it, which is probably the con I'm actually aiming at. But you can counterbalance it as well with Neomuna being an absolute amazing map design. It fits the narrative of Strand very well. You can pretty much fly around anywhere. I've not hit a ceiling yet, which is nice to see because I'm getting sick of hitting ceilings when I'm going too high. So the fact that I can use Strand and go really high into the sky really is a nice breath of fresh air. But that is as much as I'm going to talk about the campaign. It was average. I'd say Witch Queen was better. But, of course, let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I would love to hear your opinions on the story. Obviously, no spoilers, please, because if there are people coming in who haven't played the campaign in its entirety, I don't want to ruin the experience for them. But that's it for the video. Thank you very much for watching, and I shall see you all in the next one.